In the vast, sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, during the darkest days of World War II, an unusual army prepared for battle. They were not elite soldiers. They were not hardened veterans. They were painters, sculptors, theater set designers, lighting experts, photographers, and magicians. Men who once created illusions for Broadway and Hollywood now found themselves in uniform, standing beneath the relentless desert sun, about to stage the most ambitious deception operation the world had ever seen. This is the untold story of how a group of artists, armed not with bullets, but with brushes and imagination, tricked an entire enemy army and helped change the tide of the war. The origins of this strange and brilliant deception began in 1941. The Allies were struggling desperately across North Africa. German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, was crushing British forces with lightning speed. His tanks cut through the desert like blades, his strategy agile and unpredictable. The Allied leadership knew that if they couldn't stop Rommel soon, the Middle East and its vital oil supply would fall into enemy hands. And so the British began to wonder, what if they couldn't match Rommel's strength, but could mislead it? The answer came from a small, obscure branch of military intelligence known as MI9 and a visionary named Geoffrey Barkas. Barkas had been a film producer and a master of special effects. He understood one truth better than almost anyone alive. Human beings can be fooled brilliantly if the illusion is big enough and if the narrative feels real. He proposed something insane, something many officers laughed at. He wanted to build fake armies, entire divisions, complete with tanks, supply trucks, artillery positions, weapon storage, command tents, and fuel depots, all created out of wood, cloth, paint, and shadows. But Barkas wasn't joking, and MI9 approved the project. Immediately, artists, carpenters, camoufleurs, sculptors, and technicians were assembled into what would become known as the Camouflage Development and Training Center, a place where warfare blended with illusion. These men invented the techniques that would fool German aircraft, tank commanders, and spies for years. They called their masterpiece Operation Bertram. It began with the illusion of weakness. The British wanted Rommel to believe they were preparing for an attack far later than they actually were. To accomplish this, Barkas and his team hid thousands of real tanks and replaced them with fake ones. Wooden frames were covered with painted canvas that perfectly resembled armored vehicles from the air. Even better, they were built in the wrong locations, deliberately creating a false pattern of troop placements. Then came the sun shield, a brilliant invention. Sun shields were giant canvas tents shaped like harmless trucks, but inside each one was a real tank. At sunrise, Allied crews would drive their armored vehicles under the covers, turning the desert into a sea of harmless transport trucks. At sunset, they would lift the sun shield, drive the tank out, and move it to a new position, swapping illusion and reality again and again. From above, German reconnaissance pilots saw exactly what Barkas wanted them to see: a slow, poorly prepared army. At the same time, the British built fake water pipelines, hundreds of kilometers long. Water was the blood of desert survival. An army could not advance without it. The British created the illusion that their real pipeline wouldn't be ready for weeks. But this pipeline was made of hollow metal, painted and propped up on the sand. It carried nothing but wind. Rommel saw the pipeline, the scattered trucks, the few tanks, and believed the British were nowhere near an attack. But the truth was the opposite. The Allies were amassing one of the largest armored forces ever to enter the North African desert. Operation Bertram was so intricate that even the smallest detail mattered. Soldiers were trained to walk in misleading patterns. Engineers built fake vehicle tracks, and artists aged the decoy equipment with sand and charcoal to look authentically weathered. Every illusion had to survive not just sight, but suspicion. As the day of battle approached, the stakes grew even higher. If Rommel discovered the ruse, the entire Allied offensive would collapse before it even began. Thousands of lives depended on the success of wooden tanks and painted canvas. And then, in late October 1942, German intelligence made a critical mistake. They sent reconnaissance aircraft directly over the British lines and reported exactly what the Allies hoped they would. British forces were weak, unprepared, and positioned for a late attack. Rommel relaxed his defenses, shifted his strongest units to the wrong location, and allowed the decoys to deceive him completely. On October 23rd, under the cover of darkness, the real Allied tanks rolled out from under their sun shields. Their engine roars shook the ground as thousands of armored beasts moved silently into attack formation. Fake tanks stayed behind, guarding empty sands. Fake supply dumps covered the shifting shadows of the real ones. Fake pipelines gleamed in the moonlight, mocking anyone who believed they carried water. At precisely 9:40 p.m., the British launched their assault at the Battle of El Alamein. The Desert Fox had been outfoxed. Rommel's forces were caught flat-footed. He had no idea that the army he thought was small and unprepared was instead massive and fully supplied. When he realized the scale of the deception, it was already too late. Tanks poured forward in overwhelming numbers. Allied artillery pounded German defenses. What Rommel thought was weeks away was suddenly upon him like a lightning storm in the desert. Over the next few days, the myth of Axis invincibility crumbled. The Allied advance was unstoppable. El Alamein became a turning point in the war, the moment the tide finally shifted against Nazi Germany. And behind that victory, hidden beneath the sandstorms and smoke, was an army of artists, dreamers, and illusionists who fought with creativity instead of weapons. But this was only the beginning of the deception tactics that would later win the war in Europe. Barkas and his team used their success to train others in the art of military illusion. One of the most famous descendants of their work was the Ghost Army of the United States, who would go on to perform incredible deception operations in France, Belgium, and Germany. They used inflatable tanks, fake radio signals, sound effects of marching troops, and phony command posts to confuse Nazi forces again and again. Their mission? Appear everywhere, exist nowhere. Be an army that lived entirely in the enemy's mind. At its peak, a single Ghost Army unit convinced German commanders that an entire U.S. armored division had arrived on the battlefield. In reality, the division consisted of a few hundred men inflating rubber tanks and broadcasting fake radio chatter. They saved thousands of American lives without ever firing a shot. What made these deception units so effective was not just the artistry or technology. It was the ability to understand how people think. Warfare is not only fought with weapons, but with perception. If you can shape what the enemy believes, you can shape their decisions and therefore shape the outcome. By late 1944, Allied deception had reached its ultimate test, Operation Fortitude, the massive hoax designed to hide the true landing point of the D-Day invasion. Fake armies were assembled in England. Fake landing craft filled mock harbors. Inflatable tanks lined the coastline. Even a fake radio network communicated non-stop fake messages. And German intelligence, despite their experience, despite their surveillance, despite their deep suspicion, believed it all. They believed it so much that even after the real D-Day landings in Normandy, they refused to move their Panzer divisions. They were convinced the Normandy attack was only a distraction and that the real invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais. Weeks passed before they realized the truth, and by then, the Allies were already deep into France. The legacy of these deception operations is profound. They shortened the war. They saved countless lives. They reshaped what military strategy could be. And they proved that creativity, imagination, and human ingenuity can be as powerful as any weapon. Yet their stories remained classified for decades. The men who created these illusions returned home quietly, never telling their families the truths of what they had done. Many took their secrets to the grave. Only in recent years have these operations come fully to light, revealing the astonishing bravery and brilliance of those who fought with shadows and mirages. Today, their work feels almost like legend, an army of artists defeating an empire, a theater of war where the stagecraft was as important as the gunfire. But these events were real, and their impact changed the world. So the next time history speaks of tanks and battles, generals and armies,